So thank you. This talk is a little bit outside my comfort zone. I'm an engineer by training, and I've worked on adaptation actions, I've worked on mitigation actions for about 10 years now. But recently, City Council challenged me to say, when you bring the adaptation plan forward, we want to know the cost if we don't do anything. So now I'm kind of delving into the world of economics and finances that is really not my strength, but I'm going to give it a try here today. Because I think it's actually a very important message for all those leaders out there that, we're going to be paying for this one way or the other. So how do we actually start taking consideration to try and reduce those costs for all of us in the future? So I'm going to start with the mitigation side. I'm going to go pretty fast through this because, again, Peter's here. He's going to speak a little bit more about Windsor's community energy plan in the future. But I kind of want to go through the costs that we developed through the creation of our mitigation plan. So back in 2017, City Council approved our community energy plan. And in order to get to that plan, we actually had to know, we had to measure our emissions. So one of the first things off the bat was how much greenhouse gases do we put out per capita? And by this sheet, you can see that the average resident in Windsor puts out 8.8 tons of CO2, okay? But that is just scraping the surface. That's what we use in our homes for heating and cooling, so electricity and natural gas, and the transportation fuels we put into our cars. That 8.8 tons does not include the carbon that's associated with the things we buy, so our clothing and our food and everything else. It does not include our travel, so air or rail. If you actually look at the Canadian government statistics for 2017, the average Canadian will put out 19.5 tons. That's 19.5. That puts us, depending on which website, in the top 5 polluters per capita globally. Okay, so we can actually put that out there. There's all these myths that we're doing our bit, and I think we're not. And when we look at Windsor, so we looked at the challenge Windsor has. So on this table, you can actually see that our Windsor baseline for our household energy use, so now we're just looking at heating and cooling and electricity use. For Windsor, in the homes in Windsor, we use 142 gigajoules of energy, compared to the Canadian average of 106 and the Ontario average of 107. And then when you actually look at our GHG emissions, we're 8.8 again, compared to the Canadian average of 9.7, and the Ontario average is 6.2. So there's something going on in Windsor, and I don't know if Peter will speak to it, but it really comes down to our housing stock. We're a very old community with very inefficient buildings, and that is part of the challenge we face in this area. So basically, I'm going to go into just the GHG emissions briefly, but if we do nothing, we're going to continue to increase. And we have Dr. Kyle Bassett's here today. He's our community energy plan administrator, and he actually released a report back in September that said, even though we have a plan, our emissions are going up. So the fact that we have a plan, if we're not acting, our emissions aren't going to go down. So the two have to go hand in hand, right? But again, if we do nothing, this is what we're looking at. And if you look at these greenhouse gas emissions and they're increasing, also think about the cost. Because in 2019, we were paying $20 per ton for GHG emissions. Next year, we'll be paying $30, and it's going to go up to $50 a ton in 2022. So there is a cost to this. Now, if the city actually acts on all the strategies within our community energy plan, this can be our future. Okay, and again, I'm not going to go into the details, but you can see there that with all the strategies, and I think there's 16 strategies in the community energy plan, we still don't reach the Ontario greenhouse gas target. We're not even close. The biggest shift happened actually before we actually did our baseline planning, and that was the elimination of the coal power plants in Ontario. So that drastically reduced our electricity profile and helped us to where we are today. Okay, so let's get into the hard costs. Again, in 2014, the community spent $842 million on energy. So that's electricity, natural gas, and transportation fuels. So think about that, $842 million. That's almost $1 billion a year in 2014. And 80% of that money leaves the community. So it goes to the refineries somewhere, or it goes to Bruce Nuclear. It's not staying in the region, providing an economic benefit to our area. So that is another challenge. So we're already paying costs for this. Again, if we do nothing, this is what we're looking at. Under the low energy price increase future, that 842 million becomes 1.8 billion by 2041. Okay, and that includes the carbon costs. On the high risk side, that actually becomes $3.2 billion of money that the community is spending on energy just for the essential needs of our community if we do nothing. But if we do take action and we do outline complete the actions within our community energy plan, under the low energy future, we can actually save $8.6 billion over the life of the plan. And under the high side, $12.4 billion. So there's already an economic payback for taking action on mitigation. So next couple slides I'm going to talk about is basically if we don't mitigate, what is the picture in Canada? So in here, I just have a slide here basically showing our low carbon future. In the 2075, 2080s, we'll have 50 days above 30 degrees. If we don't do anything, we're looking at almost 70 days above 30. Okay, so what is the implications of not doing anything? So back in 2011, there was a report by the National Roundtable on the Environment and Energy, which estimated that the climate change costs for Canada could escalate from roughly $5 billion per year in 2020, so next year, to between $21 and $43 billion per year by the 2050s. Okay? The magnitude of the cost will depend on a couple factors. One will be the global emissions, as well as the economic growth and population growth in Canada. But the modeling also shows that there is a cost risk that is significantly higher than those stated. In the 2050s, where climate change costs are estimated at $21 billion per year in the low climate change, slow growth scenario, there's a 5% chance that these costs will actually be $43 billion per year. In the high climate change scenario, climate-related costs are estimated at $43 billion by the 2050s, but there's also a 5% chance that these costs will be $91 billion in 2050. Okay, so that's the Canadian costs. And then if you actually project forward a little bit more to 2075, where the differences of not acting are actually going to be much more pronounced, you will see that, and as this table shows, the annual costs are substantially lower in the low carbon future than in the high carbon future. So you actually have basically a difference of $72 billion on the adaptation side, or the impacts, climate impacts and risk side, if we don't take action. But then in the high end, we're looking at $295 billion difference between our low carbon future and our higher carbon future. So that is the risk we're taking right now, and that's the risk we're looking at if we don't mitigate today. So again, that's quite substantial. Okay, so let's move into the adaptation side. What happens if we don't adapt? And I think a lot of the communities here are adapting. We've had a number of storms that affected Windsor, Tecumseh, Amherstburg. We've all been impacted some way or another, and we're all doing something. But I guess the question is, are we doing enough? So in 2016, this is a Canadian study again, the Office of the Auditor General of Canada published a report by the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development titled Mitigating the Impacts of Severe Weather. The report states that from 2009 through 2015, the federal government spent more on recovering from large-scale natural disasters in those 6 years than the whole previous 39 years together through disaster financial assistance arrangements. So even the Canadian government is starting to take stock that they are paying more for municipalities to recover. Okay, so let's bring it back to the Windsor context. So just a couple things that everybody knows about. So the tornado in 2016, there was two of them. One hit LaSalle and one hit Windsor. The city of Windsor had basically response costs of about $101,000. So that's just, out of pocket, going up and cleaning up the debris, fixing the guardrails on the expressway. We also had other financial losses, which I didn't include here, but the Transit Windsor Center had solar panels that were basically installed and went active the day before the tornado hit. And the tornado took them all off. So they had basically, luckily we had insurance to basically put the solar panels back up, but we lost the year's revenue that we would have generated through our agreements with the provincial government. So there was an economic loss to the city. The flooding of 2016 in Windsor and Tecumseh, we declared state of emergency. In Windsor alone, we had almost 3,000 homes flood. But the cost to the city, $285,000 for response. So again, those are costs that the city had to cover. And then the insured losses through the IBC was $108 million. And I'll come back to that in a minute. 11 months later, we had the August 2017 flood. So that hit Windsor, LaSalle, McGregor, Tecumseh, Amherstburg, Lakeshore. It basically devastated this whole region. The city's costs were $1.69 million to recover. So that's how much we paid just to clean up people's garbage from their basements, to just respond to the storm. And the insured losses were $124 million. So, we're already seeing these costs. But these costs are just the beginning. If you actually, in 2017-18, we looked at, and we partnered with Partners for Action and Canadian Red Cross to actually survey our residents to say how much did the storm cost you and other issues. So this table basically shows you in Windsor how much people paid to recover their basements. So on average, the Insurance Bureau of Canada says to restore a basement, you're looking at $43,000, is what they're saying on average. But in Windsor, we actually had people reporting over $100,000 in damage. So again, significant personal costs to our residents. And how did these people pay? Only 45% actually had insurance. And that number is going down. Insurance companies are not providing affordable insurance to areas in Windsor anymore. And it's probably the same in a lot of communities across the county. So 40% paid through personal savings, or they refinanced their home. They took out bank loans, they cashed in their RSPs. Less than 1% actually got disaster assistance, even though the municipalities had issued state of emergency. So again, this is costing our residents right now. And then if you actually look at our cumulative totals for the city, you can see the storms. This is just since 2016. In response costs alone, we're nearing $3 million. So that's $3 million the city of Windsor didn't have set aside for emergency response. So that number, 2009 number, is, it's asterisk because we're still accruing costs from the high lake levels. But then the city also had to reconstruct our marina. And we know the original bids were about $2.5 million. But because everybody in the region and everybody in the Great Lakes Basin is now trying to build floating docks, our prices are escalating. So, council recently approved an extra $2 million to rebuild the marinas. So that's $4 million. Again, that the city did not expect to be spending right now. And then damages to the Peche Island shoreline, another $2.5 million. So the city is having to rejuggle their finances to make sure these things are covered. Okay, so let's get into what are the possible economic impacts. So with the result of all the flooding we've had, the city has been undertaking a sewer master plan for the last couple years. And this is kind of a map of the model that shows who's at risk under a 5-year storm, 5-year, 20-year, and 100-year storm. So anything in orange is basically you're at risk if a 5-year storm hits you, and then you have the 20 and the 100-year. So what does that mean in terms of numbers? Because again, that's what we're trying to get to. How much is this going to cost us? So a current 1 in 5-year storm, which under our climate projections and our new IDF curves actually shows that it will return 1 in every 3 years, there's over 22,000 properties that are currently at risk of flooding. That would be about $1 billion in losses. That's just if we look at the $43,000 for basements. I'm not factoring in any city infrastructure losses, social costs. We know from our Partners for Action survey, people are coming home from work. They're leaving work because they're worried about their basements. So if there's a heavy storm, they're leaving work. So there's lost productivity losses, there's anxiety, there's mental health issues. And then of course, we know that in some of our storms that there was large corporations that had closed down because of flooding. So then it just gets worse. The 1 in 25-year storm becomes the 1 in 8. 55,000 properties, that's almost $2.5 billion in losses. The 1 in 100 becomes the 1 in 20. That's almost $3 billion. So here's the possible costs. Now, I want to say this isn't necessarily the worst case because we haven't seen a storm that hovers over the whole city. We've had pockets, but this is what's possible if we do get hit with something like a Hurricane Hazel where it drenches the whole city. Another study we've been doing is our East Riverside flood study. So basically, again, just modeling under our current high water levels, the 176. Right now, our dike is holding along the riverfront. If it wouldn't hold, the blue is where it would be underwater. Based on our climate projections, our current 1 in 100-year high water level, this is what we're looking at. That's 176.5. All of a sudden, the dike is no longer sufficient to hold back the water, and that's what would be flooded. And under this scenario, the Low River Pollution Control Plant is also underwater. Okay, so that provides all the treatment for Tecumseh and a little piece of Lakeshore as well. So when you look at, and then we have, of course, our future 1 in 100 years, so in the 2050s, this is what it looks like. So again, if the city does nothing, you can see the number of properties that are affected. And this does not include if the the Low River Pollution Control Plant goes underwater and needs to shut down. That's going to affect another 29,000 homes on top of this. Okay, so that's the cost we're looking at. But it's not always just the big things that we have to consider. It's the little community things that people are passionate about. So again, Claire mentioned it, the summer or the spring rain we get. We actually looked back at our Parks and Rec and we looked at how much money we lost in revenue. So when community groups come to us and book our sports fields, our soccer fields, or our baseball fields, they pay us in advance for the season. This is how much money we had to refund because we could not open our fields. Okay, so if this continues, we're losing attributes and community benefits that people, they want to play soccer in the spring, they want to play baseball. And one of the challenges we're facing is we can't shift the season because at the same time, those same community groups are saying it's too hot in the summer. We'd want to get away from playing soccer and baseball in July and August because it's too hot in Windsor. They want the shoulder seasons, but yet we can't get them out there because of the rain. So there's a community loss there. Now, tying this back into the mitigation side, under the Climate Atlas, we're actually looking at increasing cooling degree days. So if we have a low carbon future or a high carbon future, you can see there by the 2050s, 2080s, going to 683 days, cooling degree days, and 877. So what does that mean? Again, tying that back to mitigation. There's the numbers. Under the high climate change scenario, which I'm just going to refer to because, unfortunately, that's the path we're on currently, the community is going to add another $81 million a year just to provide cooling capacity, to our homes and to our businesses. So that's 81 million on top of the 1.8 billion or the 3.2 billion we're already expecting. And then for the city emissions are only 2% of the whole region's emissions, but we're looking at $2.5 million in just city costs. Okay, now I'm going to turn to a couple of really good examples that other cities have done. So this is the city of Edmonton, when they were actually creating their adaptation plan, hired a consultant called All in One Sky, and they looked at the economic costs for Edmonton. And this is just one slide. I really, if you can find this information, it'd be great. But you can see there that the benefits of adapting. So I'm going to have to come out because I need to use the pointer. So here, basically, if you do nothing, this is what we're looking at. That's the future we're looking at. Okay? This part here is the net benefit. So that is basically the overall benefit. And then this gray is basically, we're going to pay, municipality will pay for will pay for the cost for doing those upgrades, but then the overall losses to the community is that bottom. So you can see there, that's almost 2/3 of the basically community benefit by investing in adaptation. So another good example, so I got something there in Edmonton. The other thing that the City of Edmonton study did, it actually looked at the payback. And it said for every dollar spent in soft measures would generate about $10 to $11 in benefits on adaptation. So when they talk about soft measures, they're talking about official plan amendments, like policy changes, community engagement and stakeholder engagement, planting trees and greening areas. And then on the other side, investing in hard measures, for every dollar invested, there's about a $3 gain. So again, this is the hard infrastructure. This is, rebuilding the docks, improving floodplains. That's more on the hard side. So another example of where this has been really successful, and this is the Red River in Winnipeg. So again, they've had problems with flooding historically, and back in the 60s, they actually decided that they needed to figure out a way to make sure that Winnipeg didn't flood. And they created the Red River Floodway at a cost of $63 million. But they basically have estimated that there's an $8 billion saved in the community since this was created. Okay? So again, that's the avoided loss by just actually thinking about adaptation and how do we do things differently. Public Safety Canada has estimated that for every dollar that we invest in climate change adaptation, $3 to $5 is saved in recovery cost. So that's the Canadian statistic. But similarly, independent studies commissioned by the US Federal Emergency Management Agency found that the return on investment in the US was $4 to every dollar, while studies in Australia have found 3 to 1, and in the UK, 5 to 1. So there's an obvious payback on adapting and adapting now. So I found this cartoon, and again, we talk about how do we engage the public. If any of you ever need really cute cartoons that are free, Sustainability Illustrated, but they basically, they talk about the fear that's created when we actually start talking about the cost. So I'm hoping in this presentation I basically spirited action and not actually fear of we can't do this, because I think hopefully this presentation showed that we have to do it, or the long term will actually be in a worse situation. And again, Claire mentioned it, but we did table our adaptation plan for public comment until January 20th. So it's online. Each of our impacts actually has a special section that has where I tried to actually do the cost of doing nothing on them. So thank you, and I'll be around all day.